Sometimes the smallest things can change everything we thought we knew about our lives. Dr. Evelyn Hart had spent decades caring for animals, but she never expected one simple farm call would touch her heart so deeply. At 62, with retirement, just around the corner, she thought her days of meaningful discoveries were over. Then the Brennan family called about a dark patch on their dairy cow's face. What seemed like a routine checkup at their Wisconsin farm turned into something much bigger. The mark on the cow wasn't just a health problem. It revealed years of struggle and heartache the family had been hiding. As Evelyn examined the animal, she realized this case would change not just the cow's future, but the entire family's destiny. Her simple diagnosis would bring together 3 generations who had been drifting apart for years. What did she discover that left everyone speechless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gravel crunched beneath the worn tires of Dr. Evelyn Hart's pickup truck as she turned into the long driveway of Meadowbrook Farm. The morning mist still clung to the rolling hills of Wisconsin, creating a soft veil over the pastures that stretched toward the horizon. At 62, Evelyn had made this type of drive thousands of times, her weathered leather veterinary bag bouncing gently in the passenger seat beside her. The bag had been her constant companion for 37 years, its surface marked with scratches and stains that told the story of a life dedicated to healing animals. She pulled up beside the red barn that had seen better days, its paint peeling, in places but still standing proud against the morning sky. The scent of hay and fresh milk carried on the breeze, familiar and comforting. This was the kind of place that reminded her why she had chosen this profession all those years ago, when she was fresh out of veterinary school with idealistic dreams of making a difference. Tom Brennan emerged from the barn, his weathered hands brushing hay from his worn flannel shirt. At 75, he moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had spent his entire life working the land. His face bore the deep lines of someone who had weathered many seasons, both literal and metaphorical. Behind him, the farm stretched, out in gentle slopes, dotted with Holstein cattle that grazed peacefully in the morning light. "Dr. Hart," Tom called out, his voice carrying the weight of years and worry. "Thank you for coming out so early." Evelyn climbed out of her truck, grabbing her bag with practiced ease. "You know me, Tom. I've never been one to keep an animal waiting." She studied his face, noting the tension around his eyes. In all her years of practice, she had learned to read farmers almost as well as she could read their animals. Tom Brennan was troubled by more than just a sick cow. They walked together toward the pasture, where a small group of dairy cows stood clustered near the fence. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grass, and Evelyn could hear the distant sound of a tractor starting up somewhere on the property. The farm had been in the Brennan family for 4 generations, and every acre seemed to hold memories. "She's over there," Tom said, pointing to a large Holstein standing apart from the others. "That's Bessie. She's been one of our best producers for 6 years now." As they approached the cow, Evelyn could see what had prompted the call. A dark, irregular patch marked the left side of Bessie's face, stretching from just below her eye toward her jaw. It looked almost like a shadow had permanently settled on her features. "When did you first notice this?" Evelyn asked, setting down her bag and approaching Bessie with the calm, confident manner that had put countless animals at ease over the decades. "About 2 weeks ago," Tom replied. "At first I thought maybe she'd gotten into something, rubbed against a fence post or had a scrape, but it hasn't changed, hasn't gotten better or worse." Evelyn gently examined the marking, her experienced, hands careful and thorough. Bessie stood patiently, as if she understood the importance of the examination. The patch felt different from the surrounding skin, not raised or irritated, but somehow changed at a cellular level. "Has she been eating normally? Any changes in milk production?" Evelyn asked, continuing her examination. "That's the strange thing," Tom said, his voice thoughtful. She's been eating fine, milk production is normal. If it weren't for this mark, I'd say she was perfectly healthy. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. A man in his mid-40s walked toward them, his modern work boots a stark contrast to his father's worn farming boots. Michael Brennan carried himself with the slightly impatient air of someone who had places to be and deadlines to meet. "Morning, Dr. Hart," Michael said, extending his hand. "I hope this won't take too long. I've got a meeting with the feed supplier in an hour." Evelyn shook his hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work despite his business-oriented approach. "I'll be as thorough as needed, Michael. Your father was right to call." Tom and Michael exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications that pass between family members who have been having the same argument for years. Evelyn had seen it countless times in farming families, the older generation holding tight to tradition, the younger generation pushing for change and efficiency. "Dad gets worried about every little thing these days," Michael said, his tone gentle but tinged with frustration. "Sometimes I think he sees problems where there aren't any." 47 years I've been raising cattle on this land," Tom said quietly. "I know when something's not right." A young woman appeared around the corner of the barn, leading a small calf on a rope halter. Sarah Brennan, at 22, had her grandfather's observant eyes and her father's determined stride. She wore practical clothes that had seen real work, and her auburn hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. "Grandpa, Mom said you wanted me to bring Clover over when the vet arrived," Sarah called out. "That's my granddaughter," Tom said with obvious pride. "Just finished her junior year studying agriculture at Madison. She's got more sense about farming than most people twice her age." Sarah approached the group, her eyes immediately drawn to Bessie and the examination in progress. "Is that the mark you were telling me about?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine scientific curiosity. "Dr. Hart's taking a look," Tom replied. "Sarah's been helping me keep track of things around here. She's got a good eye for details." Michael's expression tightened slightly. "Sarah should be focusing on her studies, not getting caught up in every little farm issue." "Understanding the land is part of my studies, Dad," Sarah replied, her tone respectful but firm. "And Grandpa's taught me things they don't cover in textbooks." Evelyn continued her examination, but she was also taking in the family dynamics playing out around her. 3 generations, each with their own perspective on the farm's future. She had seen this tension in many farming families, the weight of tradition against the pressure of economic reality, the wisdom of experience against the energy of youth. "Dr. Hart," Sarah said, stepping closer to observe the examination, "I've been reading about some unusual skin conditions in dairy cattle. Have you seen anything like this before?" Evelyn looked up, impressed by the young woman's engagement. "I've seen similar markings, though each case is unique." "What kind of research have you been doing?" "I'm working on a project about environmental factors affecting livestock health," Sarah explained. "There's been some interesting research on how soil and water quality can manifest in unexpected ways in animal populations." Michael checked his watch. "Sarah, Dr. Hart doesn't need a lecture on your college projects." "Actually, I'm interested in what she's learned," Evelyn said, her tone kind but pointed. "Fresh perspectives can be valuable, especially when they're backed by current research." Tom nodded approvingly. "That's what I've been telling her. Book, learning and practical experience, they work best together." Evelyn finished her initial examination of Bessie and stood back, her expression thoughtful. The marking was unlike anything she had seen in her recent practice, but something about it nagged at her memory. A case from years ago, or perhaps something she had read in a veterinary journal. "I'd like to take some samples," she said, opening her bag and retrieving the necessary supplies. "Blood work, a small skin sample. I want to rule out any underlying conditions." "Whatever you think is best," Tom said immediately. Michael looked less certain. "What kind of costs are we talking?" "The farm's budget is pretty tight right now." "Dad," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying a note of concern that went beyond the immediate situation. Evelyn had heard this conversation before, in barns and pastures across the state. Family farms struggling with rising costs, aging equipment, and market pressures that seemed to grow stronger every year. She had watched too many families lose operations that had been passed down through generations. "Let's focus on getting answers first," Evelyn said diplomatically. "We can work out the details after we know what we're dealing with." As she collected the samples, Evelyn found herself thinking about her own situation. In just 3 months, she would officially retire from her practice. Dr. Peterson, the young veterinarian who was buying her out, was eager and capable, but he lacked the decades of experience that allowed her to see patterns and connections that might not be obvious. To others, "Dr. Hart," Tom said as she labeled the sample containers, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. In all your years of practice, have you ever seen a case where something that looked simple turned out to be part of a bigger problem?" Evelyn paused in her work, struck by the question. Tom's weathered face held an expression of genuine concern, and she realized he was asking about more than just Bessie's condition. "More often than I care to count," she replied honestly. "Sometimes what we see on the surface is just the beginning of the story." Michael shifted impatiently. "Are we talking about a skin condition or something more serious?" "That's what the tests will tell us," Evelyn said. "But your father's instincts deserve respect. Experience has a way of sensing things that tests might not immediately reveal." Sarah moved closer to Bessie, studying the marking with the intense focus of someone genuinely interested in understanding. "Grandpa, have you noticed anything else different lately, with the other animals or around the farm?" Tom was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving across his pastures and buildings. "Nothing I could put my finger on," he said finally. "Just a feeling that things aren't quite right, the way they used to be." "What do you mean?" Evelyn asked, her professional curiosity engaged. "Hard to explain," Tom said. "Little things. The way the grass grows in certain areas, how the animals behave sometimes. Changes so gradual you might not notice unless you've been watching the same land for decades." Michael sighed. "Dad sees meaning in every cloud formation and wind direction. Sometimes a sick cow is just a sick cow, and sometimes it's not," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a wisdom that seemed beyond her years. Evelyn finished collecting her samples and stood, brushing dust from her knees. The morning sun had burned off most of the mist, revealing the full beauty of the rolling Wisconsin countryside. But Tom's words had planted a seed of concern in her mind, the kind of intuitive worry that came from years of experience, reading the subtle signs that animals and land provided. "I'll get these to the lab today," she said, packing her equipment. "We should have preliminary results by tomorrow, full analysis by the end of the week." "Thank you, Dr. Hart," Tom said, his relief evident. "I know I can trust you to get to the bottom of this." As Evelyn walked back to her truck, she found herself looking more carefully at the farm around her. The buildings were well maintained despite their age, the fences were sturdy, and the animals appeared healthy and well cared for. But there was something in Tom's voice, a deeper concern that spoke to instincts honed by decades of farming. She loaded her bag into the truck and turned back to the family. 3 generations stood together by the fence, but their body language spoke of underlying tensions and unspoken concerns that went far beyond a single cow's mysterious marking. "I'll call as soon as I have news," Evelyn promised, as she drove. Down the gravel driveway, Evelyn found herself thinking about retirement and legacy. In 3 months, she would hand over her practice to a capable young veterinarian who understood modern techniques and had access to the latest diagnostic equipment. But would he have the intuitive understanding that came from decades of reading the subtle language of animals and the people who cared for them? The image of Bessie's marked face stayed with her as she drove toward town, along with Tom's quiet, words about things not being quite right. Sometimes the smallest changes were harbingers of larger problems, and sometimes a single case could reveal truths that had been hidden just beneath the surface of what everyone thought they knew. The call came at 6:30 the next morning, just as Evelyn was settling down with her first cup of coffee and the lab results that had arrived by email an hour earlier. Tom's voice on the phone carried a tension she hadn't heard the day before. "Dr. Hart, I'm sorry to call so early, but I think you need to see something. Can you come back out to the farm?" Evelyn set down her coffee and reached for the printed lab reports. "Tom, I actually have Bessie's test results right here. The preliminary findings show it's not just Bessie anymore." Tom interrupted, his voice heavy with worry. "I spent half the night walking the pastures, and I found 2 more animals with similar markings. Different locations, but the same. Kind of dark patches." Evelyn felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the feeling she got when a simple case was about to become something much more complex. "I'll be there in an hour. Don't move those animals, and keep them separate from the rest of the herd if possible." The drive to Meadowbrook Farm felt different this morning. The Wisconsin countryside looked the same. Rolling green hills dotted with farms, morning mist rising from the valleys. But Evelyn's mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. Multiple animals showing similar symptoms suggested either an infectious agent or environmental exposure. Both scenarios could spell disaster for a family farm. When she arrived, Tom was waiting by the barn with Michael and Sarah. The tension between father and son was palpable, and Sarah looked like she hadn't slept much either. "Show me, Evelyn," I said, grabbing her bag and falling into step beside Tom. They walked to a smaller pasture behind the main barn, where Tom had isolated 3 cows. Evelyn immediately recognized Bessie, but her attention was drawn to the other 2 animals. A younger Holstein showed a similar dark patch on her neck, while an older cow had markings on both sides of her face. "When did you first notice these?" Evelyn asked, beginning her examination of the second cow. "That's just it," Tom said, his voice frustrated. "Looking back, I think the signs were there for weeks, maybe longer, but they were so faint, so gradual, that I didn't really see them until I knew what to look for." Michael paced nearby, his agitation evident. "Dad, you can't blame yourself for not seeing something that wasn't obvious. This is exactly the kind of thing that happens when what?" Tom's voice carried a sharp edge. "When an old farmer doesn't know his own animals anymore." "That's not what I meant," Michael said, but his tone suggested it was exactly what he meant. Sarah stepped between them. "Can we focus on the animals right now? Grandpa, show Dr. Hart what you found in the barn." Tom led them to a small office. Attached to the barn, a cramped space filled with decades of farm records, feed receipts and veterinary documentation. On the desk sat a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and use. "I started keeping detailed records about 15 years ago," Tom explained, opening the journal to pages covered with his careful handwriting. Not just the official stuff for taxes and inspections, but observations about the animals, their behavior, health patterns. Evelyn studied the pages, impressed by the thoroughness of Tom's documentation. He had noted everything from individual cows' eating habits to seasonal variations in milk production. But as she read through the more recent entries, a troubling pattern began to emerge. "You've been tracking health issues for months," she observed, pointing to entries that documented subtle changes in appetite, minor behavioral shifts, and what Tom had described as off days for various animals. "I thought I was being overly cautious," Tom admitted. "Michael kept telling me I was worrying about normal variations." "These aren't normal variations," Evelyn said, her voice serious. "This suggests a chronic exposure to something that's been affecting your herd gradually over time." Michael looked over her shoulder at the journal entries. "Why didn't you show me this before, Dad? If you were seeing problems, we should have called a vet months ago." The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken tensions. Sarah finally broke it, her voice gentle but pointed. "Because every time Grandpa mentioned a concern, you told him he was being overly cautious or looking for problems that Weren't there? Michael's face flushed. That's not, I didn't. He stopped, the truth of Sarah's words clearly hitting home. Evelyn continued reading through the journal, noting the careful documentation of dates, weather patterns, and even Tom's observations about changes in the surrounding environment. It was the work of someone who understood that farming was about reading countless subtle signals and responding to patterns that might not be immediately obvious. "Tom, this is incredibly valuable information," she said. "The pattern you've documented here suggests environmental exposure rather than an infectious disease. Something in their food, water, or environment has been affecting them gradually. What does that mean for the farm?" Michael asked, his business-oriented mind immediately jumping to implications. "It means we need to test everything," Evelyn replied. "Water sources, soil samples, feed quality, and we need to expand our examination to the entire herd." Sarah had been quietly studying her grandfather's journal entries. "Grandpa, look at this pattern. The animals showing symptoms are all ones that graze in the eastern pastures or drink from the creek that runs along that side of the property." Tom followed her finger as she traced the pattern across several pages. "You're right. I hadn't connected it to location, but they all spend time in that area." Michael's expression grew more troubled. "The eastern pastures border the Hart well, a property they put in that new operation about 3 years ago." "What kind of operation?" Evelyn asked. "Industrial farming," Tom said, his distaste evident. "Large-scale crop production, heavy machinery, lots of chemical treatments. Complete opposite of how we do things here." Evelyn felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to align in her mind. "We need to test the water and soil from those eastern areas immediately, and I want to examine every animal in your herd, not just the ones showing obvious symptoms." "Dr. Hart," Sarah said hesitantly, "if this is environmental contamination affecting our animals, could it be affecting other farms too?" It was a question that Evelyn had been dreading, but Sarah was right to ask it. If Meadowbrook Farm was experiencing contamination from a neighboring operation, other farms in the area could be at risk as well. "That's exactly what we need to find out," Evelyn said. "But first, we focus on your animals and getting them the help they need." Michael ran his hands through his hair, the stress evident in every line of his body. "If this is contamination, if we have to deal with legal issues or environmental cleanup, the farm can't afford it. We're already operating on thin margins." "Dad," Sarah said softly, "we can't afford not to deal with it. If the animals are being poisoned, it's only going to get worse." Tom closed his journal and looked at his son and granddaughter. 47 years I've worked this land. I've seen droughts, floods, market crashes, disease outbreaks, but I've never felt like the land itself was working against us." The weight of his words settled over the group. Evelyn understood that for Tom, this wasn't just about sick animals or financial loss. It was about the fundamental relationship between a farmer and the land that had sustained his family for generations. "We're going to figure this out," Evelyn said, her voice carrying the authority of decades of experience. "But it's going to require all of us working together. Tom, your documentation is going to be crucial. Michael, we'll need your organizational skills to coordinate testing and potentially legal action. Sarah, your research background could help us understand what we're dealing with." For the first time since her arrival, the 3 generations of Brennans looked at each other without the tension that had marked their earlier interactions. The crisis was bringing them together in a way that years of family discussions about the farm's future had failed to do. "What's our next step?" Michael asked. Evelyn looked out the barn door toward the eastern pastures, where the morning sun was revealing the full scope of the land that 4 generations of Brennans had called home. "We get answers," she said, "and then we decide what we're going to do about them." As they walked back toward the house to begin making the necessary calls for comprehensive testing, Evelyn realized that her simple retirement timeline had just become much more complicated. But looking at the determination in Tom's weathered face, the concern in Michael's eyes, and the scientific curiosity in Sarah's expression, she knew she couldn't walk away from this case. Some problems demanded more than just medical expertise. They required the kind of commitment that went beyond professional duty into something deeper and more personal. 3 days later, Evelyn returned to Meadowbrook Farm with a systematic plan and a growing sense of urgency. The comprehensive herd examination would require most of the day, and she had asked Sarah to assist her. The young woman's agricultural background and genuine interest in the science behind the problem made her an ideal partner for the detailed work ahead. Sarah met her at the truck, wearing practical work clothes and carrying a clipboard with detailed notes. "I've organized the herd by age, location preference, and grazing patterns," she said, showing Evelyn the charts she had prepared. "Grandpa helped me track which animals spend the most time in different parts of the farm." Evelyn was impressed by Sarah's thoroughness. "This kind of systematic approach is exactly what we need. Your grandfather's observations combined with your organizational skills gives us a real advantage." They walked toward the main pasture where Tom had gathered the first group of cattle for examination. Michael was there as well, having taken time off from his other responsibilities to help with the process. The family dynamic seemed different today, more focused, more united by their shared concern for the animals. "Dr. Hart," Tom called out, "I've separated them into 3 groups like you asked. The ones that primarily graze the eastern pastures, the ones that stay mostly on the western side, and the ones that move between both areas." As Evelyn began her examinations, Sarah took detailed notes, recording not just the obvious symptoms, but subtle variations in behavior, coat condition, and general demeanor. Her agricultural studies had taught her to look for patterns that might not be immediately obvious to someone without her background. "This cow here," Sarah said, pointing to a Holstein in the eastern grazing group. "She doesn't have the obvious dark markings, but her coat has a different texture than the others, almost like it's been stressed at a cellular level." Evelyn examined the animal Sarah had indicated. The young woman was right. There were subtle signs of systemic stress that wouldn't be apparent to a casual observer. "Good eye," she said. "What you're seeing suggests chronic low-level exposure to something that's affecting their overall health, not just causing the visible markings." Michael watched their work with growing concern. "How many animals are we talking about in terms of potential treatment costs?" "Dad, let's focus on understanding the scope first," Sarah said, her tone patient but firm. "We need to know what we're dealing with before we can make financial decisions." Tom approached with the afternoon group of cattle, his expression troubled. "I've been thinking about what Sarah found in my records, the pattern of problems. They started getting worse about 2 years ago, right around the time Hartwell Industries expanded their operation next door." Evelyn looked up from her examination. "What kind of expansion?" "They doubled their acreage and started using much more intensive chemical applications," Tom explained. "Big trucks coming and going, spray equipment running at all hours. The smell alone was enough to make you want to stay indoors on certain days." Sarah made notes while continuing to assist with the examinations. "In my environmental agriculture classes, we studied cases where industrial farming operations affected neighboring properties through groundwater contamination and chemical drift." "You think that's what's happening here?" Michael asked. "It fits the pattern," Evelyn said, gently examining a cow that showed early signs of the mysterious markings. "Gradual onset, affecting animals based on their exposure to specific areas of the farm, getting progressively worse over time." As they worked through the afternoon, the scope of the problem became increasingly clear. Nearly 30% of the herd showed some level of symptoms, from the obvious dark markings to the subtle signs of systemic stress that Sarah had learned to identify. "Dr. Hart," Sarah said during a break, "I've been doing some research on environmental contamination cases in dairy operations. She pulled out a folder filled with printed articles and research papers. There are documented cases where industrial agricultural runoff caused similar symptoms in neighboring livestock. Evelyn reviewed the papers Sarah had gathered, impressed by the thoroughness of her research. These cases are remarkably similar to what we're seeing here. The gradual onset, the skin manifestations, the systemic stress indicators. Michael looked over the research with a businessman's eye for details. In these other cases, what were the outcomes? Were the farms able to recover? Sarah turned to a particular case study. In Kansas, a family farm successfully sued an industrial operation for contamination. They received compensation for animal treatment, lost production, and environmental cleanup. The industrial operation was required to implement better containment measures. But, she continued, her voice more somber, in Nebraska, a similar case dragged through courts for 5 years. By the time it was resolved, the family farm had gone bankrupt from legal costs and ongoing losses. Tom sat heavily on a hay bale, the weight of the situation evident in his posture. 47 years building this operation, and now we might lose everything because of what someone else is doing to our land. Grandpa, we don't know that yet, Sarah said, sitting beside him. The research shows that early intervention and proper documentation can make a huge difference in outcomes. Evelyn finished examining the last cow in the group and stood back to survey the herd. Sarah's right. The detailed records your grandfather kept, combined with systematic documentation of the current situation, gives us a strong foundation for whatever action we decide to take. Michael paced near the fence, his business mind clearly working through scenarios. Even if we can prove contamination, the legal process could take years. Can we afford to keep the farm running while dealing with ongoing animal health issues and legal expenses? Can we afford not to fight? Sarah asked. If we don't address the contamination, the problems will only get worse. Eventually, we might lose the entire herd. Tom looked across his pastures toward the eastern boundary, where the Hartwell operation was visible in the distance. I never wanted to be the kind of neighbor who causes problems. Always believed in working things out peacefully. This isn't about causing problems, Grandpa, Sarah said. This is about protecting our animals and our land. Evelyn packed her equipment, her mind working through the implications of what they had discovered. I need to get water and soil samples from the eastern areas tested immediately. We also need to document everything we've found today in a format that could be used for legal purposes if necessary. What does that mean exactly? Michael asked. Detailed medical records for every affected animal, photographic documentation of symptoms, correlation with your father's observational records, Evelyn explained. Essentially building a case that demonstrates the pattern and timeline of contamination. Sarah looked thoughtful. I could help with that. My research methodology training could be useful for organizing the evidence in a scientifically rigorous way. For the first time since the crisis began, Michael looked at his daughter with something approaching respect rather than concern about her involvement. That could actually be valuable, he admitted. Tom stood and walked toward the eastern pasture, his weathered hands resting on the fence rail. You know what hurts the most? It's not just about the money or even the animals, though I care about both. It's that this land has been in our family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather cleared these fields by hand, built the original barn with timber cut from our own woods. Sarah joined him at the fence. That's exactly why we have to fight, Grandpa. Not just for us, but for what this place represents. Evelyn watched the 3 generations standing together, united by their shared love for the land and their growing understanding of what they might be up against. The veterinary case had evolved into something much larger, a battle for the survival of a way of life that was becoming increasingly rare. I'll have the environmental test results by early next week, she said. Once we have scientific confirmation of contamination, we'll need to make some serious decisions about how to proceed. As evening approached and they finished their work, Evelyn realized that her own retirement plans were becoming increasingly distant considerations. The Brennan family's crisis had become her crisis, and walking away was no longer an option she could seriously consider. The following Saturday morning, Evelyn found herself in Tom's kitchen, surrounded by 4 generations of Brennan family history. The walls were covered with photographs spanning nearly a century, images of prize-winning cattle, family gatherings at harvest time, and the gradual evolution of Meadowbrook Farm from a small homestead to a substantial dairy operation. Tom sat across from her at the worn wooden table, carefully turning pages in a photo album that looked almost as old as the farm itself. "My great-grandfather Henrik bought this land in 1923, he said, pointing to a sepia-toned photograph of a stern-faced man standing beside a simple wooden barn. 40 acres and a dream. That's all he had. Evelyn studied the old photographs with growing appreciation for the farm's history. The images told a story of steady growth and careful stewardship, each generation building on what came before, always with an eye toward leaving something better for the next generation. "This is Henrik with his first herd," Tom continued, showing her a photograph of a dozen cattle grazing in what was now the eastern pasture. He cleared that land by hand, pulled stumps with draft horses. Took him 3 years to get it ready. For grazing, Sarah entered the kitchen carrying a laptop and several files. "Morning, Dr. Hart. I've been putting together a comprehensive analysis of Grandpa's records and your examination findings." She set her materials on the table and opened the laptop. "I think you'll find the correlations interesting." On the screen, Sarah had created detailed charts and graphs that mapped the progression of animal health issues against timeline, location, and weather patterns. Her academic training was evident in the professional quality of the analysis. "This is impressive work," Evelyn said, studying the data visualization. "You've identified patterns that might not have been obvious from looking at individual cases." Michael appeared in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, and the slightly haggard look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. "Any breakthrough insights from all this analysis?" "Actually, yes," Sarah said, highlighting a particular section of her chart. "The symptoms consistently began appearing in animals that spent time in areas with direct water runoff from the eastern boundary. But more importantly, the timeline correlates almost perfectly with seasonal spray schedules from industrial operations." Tom leaned forward to look at the screen. "You can track it that precisely. The pattern is unmistakable once you map it properly," Sarah explained. "Spring and early fall applications seem to create the most severe reactions, probably because that's when the chemicals are most concentrated and weather conditions favor runoff." Evelyn compared Sarah's analysis with the historical photographs Tom had been showing her. "Tom, in these older pictures, that eastern pasture looks different. The vegetation, the way the cattle are distributed." "You're right," Tom said, studying a photograph from the 1980s. "The grass used to grow much thicker there, and the cattle loved that area. It was some of our best grazing land." Michael sat down at the table, his business-oriented mind engaging with the implications. "So, we're not just talking about recent contamination. This has been a gradual degradation over several years, which explains why it was so hard to identify initially," Evelyn added. "By the time the symptoms became obvious, the contamination was well established." Sarah pulled out another file. "I've also been researching the legal precedents for this type of situation. Dr. Hart, the cases you need to know about are here." She spread out copies of court documents and news articles about similar environmental contamination cases. The Patterson Farm in Ohio won a significant settlement against an industrial agricultural operation in 2019, Sarah explained. But the key to their success was early documentation and expert testimony that could demonstrate the progression and costs of contamination. Tom picked up one of the legal documents, his weathered hands careful with the papers. These other families, they had to fight for years to get justice. "Some did," Sarah acknowledged. "But the ones who documented everything from the beginning, and had strong expert testimony, had much better outcomes. Michael looked at Evelyn. Would you be willing to serve as an expert witness if this goes to court? The question hung in the air, loaded with implications for Evelyn's retirement plans and her growing emotional investment in the Brennan family's situation. That's a significant commitment, she said carefully. Legal cases can drag on for years, and expert witnesses need to be available for depositions, court appearances, ongoing consultation. I understand if it's too much to ask, Tom said quietly. You've already done more than any of us had a right to expect. Evelyn looked around the kitchen, at the photographs documenting 4 generations of careful farming, at Sarah's meticulous research, at Michael's growing understanding of what they were facing, and at Tom's quiet dignity in the face of a threat to everything he had worked to build. Let me ask you something, she said. If we can prove contamination, if we can build a strong case, are you prepared for what that fight might involve? Michael answered first. From a practical standpoint, we have to try. The alternative is watching the farm slowly die while we pretend the problem will go away on its own. Sarah nodded agreement. And from a research standpoint, we have all the elements needed for a strong case. Grandpa's documentation, your medical expertise, environmental test results, and legal precedents. Tom was quiet for a long moment, studying. The photographs spread across the table. 4 generations of my family have worked this land. My great-grandfather Henrik didn't speak much English when he started here, but he understood that the land would take care of you if you took care of it. He picked up a photograph showing the farm during the 1950s, when his own father was running the operation. My dad always said that farming wasn't just about making a living. It was about being a steward for something bigger than yourself, leaving the land better than you found it. That's exactly what we're fighting for, Sarah said. Softly, Michael looked at his daughter and father, then at Evelyn. Dr. Hart, I know we're asking a lot, but if you're willing to help us through this, I promise we'll do whatever it takes to build the strongest case possible. Evelyn made her decision. I'll need to make some arrangements with Dr. Peterson about extending my transition timeline, but yes, I'll help you fight this. The relief on Tom's face was immediate and profound. Thank you, he said simply. Sarah immediately began organizing her research materials. I'll start preparing formal documentation of everything we've found. Dr. Hart, what do you need from me to support the medical evidence? Detailed correlation between your grandfather's observational records and our clinical findings, Evelyn replied. We need to show a clear pattern that demonstrates cause and effect. Michael stood and walked to the window overlooking the eastern pastures. There's something I need to tell you all. I've been doing some research of my own into Hartwell Industries. Operations, he turned back to face the group, his expression serious. They're not just a local operation. They're part of a much larger corporate agriculture entity with operations in 6 states. They have significant legal resources and a track record of fighting environmental claims aggressively. What does that mean for us? Tom asked. It means we're going up against opponents with deep pockets and experience in exactly this kind of fight, Michael replied. But it also means that if we can win, the precedent could help other farms facing similar situations. Sarah looked up from her laptop. Then we'd better make sure our case is absolutely bulletproof. Evelyn gathered the photographs and documents they had been reviewing, struck by the contrast between the historical images of a thriving farm and the current crisis threatening its survival. We will, she said with quiet determination. But first we need those environmental test results to confirm what we already suspect. The environmental test results arrived on a Wednesday morning that felt heavy with the promise of rain. Evelyn sat in her office, staring at the laboratory reports that confirmed everything they had suspected and feared. The water samples from the Eastern Creek showed elevated levels of 3 different herbicides and 2 fungicides, all at concentrations well above safe limits for livestock consumption. The soil samples were even worse, revealing a contamination pattern that extended Nearly 50 feet onto Brennan property from the eastern boundary line, she reached for her phone to call Tom, then hesitated. Once she made this call, there would be no going back to simpler times when the biggest worry was a single cow with mysterious markings. This was the moment when suspicion became fact, when a family farm's fight for survival became a legal reality. Tom answered on the second ring. "Dr. Hart, do you have news?" "I have the test results," Evelyn said carefully. "Can you gather Michael and Sarah? I think we should go over this together." An hour later, she sat in the Brennan kitchen once again, this time with official laboratory documents spread across the table. The 3 generations of farmers sat quietly as she explained the technical details of contamination levels, safety thresholds, and the implications for both animal and human health. "So it's definitive," Michael said when she finished. "We're dealing with chemical contamination from the Hartwell operation. The evidence is clear," Evelyn confirmed. "The contamination pattern, the timeline, and the specific chemicals all point to agricultural runoff from their expanded operations." Sarah studied the detailed soil maps that showed contamination spreading like fingers across the eastern portion of the farm. This explains why the symptoms appeared gradually and why they were concentrated in specific areas. The chemicals have been building up in the soil and water system for at least 2 years. Tom picked up one of the water quality reports, his weathered hands careful with the official document. "What does this mean for the animals that have been drinking from that creek? We need to immediately relocate any cattle that have access to the contaminated areas," Evelyn said. "The good news is that with proper treatment and clean environment, most of the affected animals should recover fully." "And the bad news?" Michael asked. "The land itself will require extensive remediation. Soil replacement, water system cleanup, ongoing monitoring. It's expensive and time-consuming, and it may not be completely reversible." Sarah had been quietly reviewing a set of historical land survey maps that she had obtained from the county office. "Dr. Hart, look at this," she said, spreading the maps alongside the contamination results. "The property boundary between our farm and Hartwell Industries has been disputed before." She pointed to notations on a 1987 survey map. There was a boundary disagreement when Hartwell first purchased the adjacent property. According to these records, there's a 15-foot strip of land that legally belongs to Meadowbrook Farm, but has been treated as part of the Hartwell operation for over a decade. Evelyn studied the survey maps with growing interest. "So they're not just contaminating your property, they're doing it from land that technically belongs to you. That could strengthen our legal position significantly," Michael said, his business mind immediately grasping the implications. "It's one thing to claim damages from neighboring property contamination, but it's another to show they've been trespassing and contaminating from our own land." Tom looked confused. "How did we not know about this boundary issue?" Sarah pulled out additional documents. "It looks like there was some informal agreement between Grandpa's father and the previous property owner. When Hartwell Industries bought the land, they inherited the use of that strip, but legally it was never transferred. My father always believed in being a good neighbor," Tom said slowly. "He probably figured it didn't matter as long as everyone got along." "Well, everyone's not getting along anymore," Michael said grimly, "and that boundary dispute could be the key to our entire case." Evelyn gathered the test results and survey maps, her mind working through the legal implications. "This changes our approach significantly. We're not just talking about environmental damages now, we're talking about trespass, unauthorized use of property, and contamination from activities conducted on land they don't legally own." Sarah had been taking notes throughout the discussion. "I need to contact my environmental law professor at Madison. She's worked on several cases involving agricultural contamination disputes." "What's our next step?" Tom asked. "We need legal representation," Michael said definitively. "This is beyond what we can handle on our own." Evelyn nodded agreement. "And we need to document everything before we take any action." Once Hartwell Industries realizes we're building a case, they may try to limit access to information or change their operations to minimize evidence. What kind of documentation? Sarah asked. Photographic evidence of the contamination sources, detailed mapping of runoff patterns, documentation of their activities on the disputed land strip, Evelyn explained. Essentially, we need to build a comprehensive record of how their operations have affected your property. Michael stood and walked to the window overlooking the eastern pastures. There's something else we need to consider. If we go public with this, if we file a lawsuit, it's going to attract attention. Other farms in the area might come forward with similar problems. Is that good or bad for our case? Tom asked. It could be both, Evelyn said. More victims would strengthen the overall case against Hartwell, but it would also make this a much bigger and more complex legal battle. Sarah looked up from her notes. In the cases I researched, the ones that were most successful had strong community support and multiple affected properties. It's harder for a corporation to dismiss claims when they're coming from an entire region. Tom was quiet for several minutes, staring at the laboratory reports that had transformed their lives from concerned farming to potential legal warfare. 47 years I've been farming this land, he said finally. I've dealt with droughts, floods, market crashes, equipment failures, but I never imagined I'd have to fight for the right to farm clean land. Grandpa, you're not just fighting for yourself, Sarah said softly. You're fighting for every family farm that's dealing with this kind of pressure from industrial agriculture. Michael returned to the table, his expression resolute. Dr. Hart, what do you need from us to move forward? First, we secure legal representation with experience in environmental law, Evelyn replied. Second, we begin systematic documentation of everything we've discovered. Third, we prepare for the possibility that this could become a very public fight. And fourth, Tom asked. We take care of the animals, Evelyn said. Whatever else happens, we make sure your herd gets the clean environment and treatment they need to recover. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the kitchen table, the four of them sat surrounded by the evidence that would either save Meadowbrook Farm or launch them into a legal battle that could consume years of their lives. The simple veterinary case that had begun with a dark patch on a cow's face had evolved into something that would test everything the Brennan family believed about justice, community, and their right to farm the land their ancestors had worked for 4 generations. The family meeting 2 weeks later felt different from any conversation the Brennans had ever had. Michael had prepared detailed financial projections, legal cost estimates, and risk assessments with the methodical precision of someone who understood that the family's entire future hung in the balance. His business plan, normally used for operational decisions, now served as a roadmap for survival. The numbers are sobering, Michael said, spreading his analysis across the dining room table. Even with insurance covering some of the animal treatment costs, we're looking at immediate expenses of at least $50,000 just to relocate the herd and secure clean water sources. Tom studied the financial projections with the same careful attention he had always given to his farming records. What about the legal costs? That's where it gets complicated, Michael replied. The environmental law firm Sarah's professor recommended works on contingency for cases like this, which means they take a percentage of any settlement instead of charging hourly fees. What percentage? Evelyn asked. 35% of any recovery, Sarah answered, but they're also willing to cover most of the upfront costs for expert witnesses, environmental testing, and case preparation. Tom leaned back in his chair, the weight of decades of financial responsibility evident in his expression. 35 years ago, when I took over the farm from my father, the biggest financial decision was whether to expand the dairy operation or focus on beef cattle. This feels like we're betting the entire farm on a legal case. We are, Michael said bluntly. If we lose, or if the case drags on for years, we could lose everything. The farm, the house, the land that's been in our family for 4 generations. The Silence that followed was heavy with the gravity of their situation. Evelyn watched the three generations grapple with a decision that went far beyond financial considerations. They were choosing between accepting the slow death of their farming operation or risking everything on a fight for justice. "What about the alternative?" Sarah asked quietly. "What happens if we don't fight?" Michael turned to a different section of his analysis. "Based on the contamination patterns and the projected spread of chemicals through the soil and water systems, we'd be looking at gradually losing more and more productive land. Within 5 years, probably half the farm would be unusable for cattle grazing." "And the animals?" Tom asked. "Ongoing health issues, reduced productivity, increased veterinary costs," Evelyn replied. "Even if we could manage the symptoms, you'd be running a marginal operation on contaminated land." Sarah had been quietly reviewing legal precedents on her laptop. "There's something else to consider. In the Nebraska case I mentioned before, the farm that chose not to fight eventually sold their land to the same corporate entity that had contaminated it, for a fraction of what it would have been worth before the contamination. So we'd lose the farm either way," Tom said, his voice reflecting the bitter irony of their situation. "Either we risk it in a legal fight, or we watch it slowly die and then sell it to the people who killed it." Michael stood and walked to the window, his gaze fixed on the eastern pastures where most of their cattle were no longer allowed to graze. "There's a third option we need to discuss. We could sell now, before the contamination becomes widely known, and try to start over somewhere else." The suggestion hit like a physical blow. Tom's face went pale, and Sarah looked as if her father had just suggested burning down the barn. "Sell Meadowbrook Farm." Tom's voice was barely above a whisper. "This land has been in our family for over a century." "Dad, I'm not saying I want to sell," Michael said, turning back to face his family. "I'm saying we have to consider all our options, no matter how painful." Sarah closed her laptop with more force than necessary. "We can't just abandon everything Grandpa's family built because some corporate operation decided our land was expendable." Evelyn found herself thinking about her own situation, the comfortable retirement she had planned, the peaceful transition to a life without the constant demands of veterinary practice. The Brennan family's crisis had already disrupted those plans, and now they were asking her to potentially sacrifice years of her life to a legal battle with uncertain outcomes. "Dr. Hart," Tom said, as if reading her thoughts, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Are we being naive? Are we taking on a fight we can't possibly win?" The question deserved a thoughtful answer. Evelyn had seen enough legal battles over the years to understand the risks and uncertainties involved. Corporate defendants with deep pockets and experienced legal teams had significant advantages over family farms with limited resources. "You're facing a formidable opponent," she said carefully. "Hartwell Industries has the resources to drag this case out for years, to hire the best defense attorneys, to make the process as expensive and difficult as possible. But," she continued, "you also have some significant advantages. The evidence of contamination is clear and well documented. The boundary dispute gives you strong legal standing. Sarah's research has identified successful precedents, and most importantly, you have the truth on your side." Michael returned to his financial analysis. "The law firm believes we have a strong case, but they also warned us that corporate agricultural defendants often settle out of court to avoid establishing legal precedents that could affect their other operations." "What would a settlement look like?" Tom asked. "Compensation for damages, cleanup costs, ongoing monitoring, and probably some kind of agreement about future operations to prevent additional contamination," Sarah replied. "But it would also likely include a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent us from talking about what happened." Tom's expression hardened. "So they could do the same thing to other farms, and we wouldn't be able to warn anyone. That's typically how these settlements work," Evelyn confirmed. The corporation gets to make the problem go away quietly, without admitting wrongdoing or changing their practices. Then maybe we need to think beyond just our own farm, Sarah said. Maybe we need to consider what our fight could mean for other farming families facing similar situations. Michael looked at his daughter with growing respect. You're talking about making this about more than just Meadowbrook Farm. I'm talking about making it count for something bigger, Sarah replied. If we're going to risk everything, let's make sure the outcome helps protect other families from going through what we're going through. Tom studied his son's financial projections one more time, then looked at his granddaughter's research, and finally at Evelyn. Dr. Hart, you've already given up your retirement plans to help us. Are you prepared to see this through to the end, whatever that might look like? Evelyn thought about the comfortable life she had planned, the travel she had postponed, the quiet years she had imagined after decades of demanding work. Then she looked at Tom's weathered hands, Sarah's determined expression, and Michael's careful analysis of their impossible situation. Yes, she said simply, I'm prepared to see this through. The decision was made not with fanfare or dramatic declarations, but with the quiet determination of people who understood that some fights were worth the risk of losing everything. The call came on a Friday afternoon in late September, just as Evelyn was finishing her review of the final environmental impact assessment. Sarah's voice on the phone carried an excitement that immediately commanded attention. Dr. Hart, you need to get out here right away. We've found something that changes everything. Evelyn arrived at Meadowbrook Farm to find Sarah and Tom standing beside a pile of soil samples, test tubes, and what appeared to be sophisticated monitoring equipment. Michael was there as well, holding a thick folder of documents and wearing the expression of someone who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew was wrong. What did you find? Evelyn asked. Sarah held up a detailed report with official letterhead from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. The contamination isn't accidental. It's deliberate. The words hit like a physical blow. Evelyn took the report and began reading, her medical training allowing her to quickly parse the technical language and understand the implications. What she found was far worse than anything they had suspected. According to this analysis, Sarah continued, the chemical applications on Hartwell property have been specifically designed to create runoff toward neighboring properties. The timing, the concentrations, the application methods, none of it follows standard agricultural practices. Tom's face was a mixture of anger and vindication. You mean they've been poisoning our land on purpose? Michael spread out additional documents on the truck tailgate. It gets worse. I've been doing some research into Hartwell Industries' corporate structure and business practices. They've been systematically acquiring family farms across the region, always at below market prices, always after the properties have experienced unexplained productivity problems. Evelyn studied the pattern Michael had documented. They contaminate neighboring properties, drive down the land values, then buy the farms at distressed prices. It's not just a theory, Sarah said, pulling out her laptop and showing them a detailed analysis. I've mapped their acquisitions over the past 5 years against reports of environmental problems. The correlation is almost perfect. The implications were staggering. What they had assumed was negligent contamination from poor agricultural practices was actually an intentional campaign to drive neighboring farms out of business. How did you discover this? Evelyn asked. Tom's expression carried the grim satisfaction of a man whose instincts had been proven correct. I started talking to other farmers in the area, quietly, just asking if they'd noticed any problems with their livestock or land quality. 3 other farms have reported similar issues, Michael added. Gradual contamination, unexplained animal health problems, decreased productivity, all of them border Hartwell properties. Sarah opened another file on her laptop. And here's the really damning evidence. I was able to access public records of chemical purchase orders for Hartwell Industries. They've been buying industrial-grade herbicides and fungicides in quantities far exceeding what they could possibly need for their declared crop production. Evelyn felt a cold anger building as she reviewed the evidence. They've been using agricultural in chemicals as weapons. The environmental test results, Dr. Hart, they showed specific chemicals that aren't even approved for the crops Hartwell claims to be growing. Sarah continued, the only reason to use those particular substances is to create maximum soil and water contamination. Michael had been unusually quiet during the presentation. Now he spoke up, his voice carrying a hardness that Evelyn had never heard before. I contacted the other affected farmers. They're all facing the same choice we are: sell at distressed prices or face financial ruin from ongoing contamination. What? Did you tell them? Evelyn asked. I told them we're going to fight, and we invited them to join us. Tom looked at his son with obvious pride. 3 of them want to meet with our lawyers. The 4th farm already sold to Hartwell last month, but the family is willing to testify about what they experienced. The scope of what they were dealing with had expanded far beyond a single family farm's environmental problem. This was a coordinated corporate campaign to systematically eliminate family farming operations across the region. This changes our legal strategy completely, Evelyn said. We're not just talking about accidental contamination damages anymore. This is fraud, intentional destruction of property, possibly criminal conspiracy. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. The environmental law firm says that with this evidence, we're looking at a completely different type of case. Punitive damages, criminal referrals, possibly federal involvement because of the interstate nature of Hartwell's operations. Michael spread out a map showing Hartwell properties and affected farms across 3 counties. If we can prove this pattern, we're not just saving our farm, we're stopping an entire campaign against family agriculture. Tom walked toward the eastern boundary, his gaze fixed on the Hartwell operation visible in the distance. 47 years I've been farming this land, and I always wondered why some corporate operation would want to set up right next to a small dairy farm. Now, I know they weren't moving in next to us, they were targeting us. Evelyn felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with possessing knowledge that could change lives. Tom, once we present this evidence, there's no going back. Hartwell Industries will throw everything they have at discrediting us. And our case. Let them try, Sarah said with fierce determination. We have documentation, expert testimony, multiple affected properties, and now we have proof of intent. Michael closed his folder of evidence. Dr. Hart, I need to ask you something important. Are you prepared for this to become a major legal battle? We're not talking about a quiet settlement anymore. This is going to be public, controversial, and probably very nasty. Evelyn thought about the comfortable retirement she had planned, the peaceful transition away from the demands and complications of professional life. Then she looked at the evidence of systematic destruction of family farms and the 3 generations of Brennans who had trusted her with their future. I've spent 37 years caring for animals and helping farming families, she said. If this is how I end my career, stopping corporate agriculture from destroying the way of life I've dedicated my life to protecting, then I can't think of a better way to finish. Sarah immediately began organizing the evidence for presentation to their legal team. I'll coordinate with the other affected families to make sure we have comprehensive documentation from all properties. Tom looked across his pastures, his weathered face showing the strain of months of uncertainty, but also something else. The resolution of a man who finally understood the true nature of the fight he was facing. My great-grandfather Henrik cleared this land with hand tools and determination, he said quietly. My grandfather survived the Depression by working harder than anyone thought possible. My father built this operation into something that could support a family and contribute to the community. He turned back to face Evelyn, Michael, and Sarah. I'll be damned if I'm going to let some corporate criminals steal what 4 generations of my family built. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Meadowbrook Farm, and for the first time since the crisis began, those shadows didn't seem ominous. They looked like the natural rhythm of land that had been carefully tended for nearly a century and would continue to be tended for generations to come if they could win the fight that lay ahead. "What's our next step?" Evelyn asked. Sarah looked at her laptop screen filled with evidence charts and legal precedents. "We take everything we've found to the lawyers, we coordinate with the other affected families, and we build a case that's going to end Hartwell Industries' campaign against family farms." "And then?" Michael asked. "Then we make them pay for what they've done," Tom said simply. "Not just to us, but to every farming family they've targeted." As evening approached and they prepared to leave the pasture where this entire crisis had begun, with a simple dark patch on a cow's face, Evelyn realized that they were no longer fighting just for the survival of one farm. They were fighting for the principle that family agriculture had a right to exist without being systematically destroyed by corporate entities that viewed traditional farming as an obstacle to their expansion. It was a fight worth risking everything for. The law office of Peterson, Martinez and Associates occupied the entire third floor of a converted warehouse in downtown Madison, its exposed brick walls and industrial fixtures reflecting the firm's reputation for taking on powerful corporate defendants. Evelyn sat at a conference table surrounded by legal documents that would serve as the foundation for what their lead attorney described as one of the most significant environmental fraud cases in Wisconsin history. "Dr. Hart, your testimony is going to be crucial to establishing the pattern of deliberate contamination," said Rebecca Martinez, the environmental law specialist who had agreed to represent the 4 affected families. "We need you to walk the jury through the progression from initial symptoms to the discovery of systematic poisoning." Evelyn reviewed her meticulously prepared testimony notes, documents that represented months of careful analysis and documentation. Every observation, every test result, every correlation between animal symptoms and environmental contamination had been organized into a comprehensive narrative that would demonstrate Hartwell Industries' deliberate campaign against family farms. "The medical evidence is compelling," Evelyn said, reviewing her analysis. "When you map the progression of animal health issues against the documented chemical applications, the pattern of deliberate targeting becomes undeniable." Sarah sat beside her, surrounded by her own research materials and looking every bit the agricultural scientist she was becoming. "Dr. Hart, I've been working with the other affected families to document similar patterns on their properties. The correlation is consistent across all 4 farms." Michael entered the conference room, carrying coffee and the latest batch of documents from their private investigator. "The PI's report on Hartwell's acquisition patterns is damning," he said, distributing copies to everyone present. "They've used identical tactics in 3 other states." Rebecca Martinez reviewed the investigator's findings with obvious satisfaction. "This establishes a pattern of racketeering that could bring federal charges. When corporations engage in systematic fraud across state lines, they expose themselves to much more serious legal consequences." Tom had been quietly studying a timeline that Sarah had prepared, showing the correlation between Hartwell's chemical applications and the onset of problems on neighboring farms. 47 years I've been farming, and I never imagined I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office preparing to testify about someone deliberately poisoning my land." "Tom, your observational records are going to be key evidence," Rebecca said. "The detailed documentation you kept provides the kind of systematic evidence that juries understand and trust." The preparation sessions had been intensive, with each family member learning how to present their part of the story in a way that would be clear and compelling to jurors who might have no background in agriculture or environmental science. Evelyn had been impressed by how the family had risen to the challenge, each finding their own way to contribute to what had become a community effort. Dr. Hart, Rebecca continued, we need to prepare for aggressive cross-examination. Hartwell's legal team will try to discredit your findings by questioning your expertise, your methodology, and your motivations. What kind of attack should I expect? Evelyn asked. They'll argue that you're not an environmental specialist, that your retirement gives you financial motivation to extend this case, that you're emotionally involved with the family rather than objective in your analysis. Sarah looked up from her preparation materials. But Dr. Hart's expertise is exactly what makes her testimony so valuable. She's not just an environmental scientist. She's someone who understands how contamination affects living animals. Michael nodded agreement, and her reputation in the agricultural community is impeccable. She's testified as an expert witness before, and she's never had her credibility successfully challenged. The door opened to admit James Peterson, the senior partner whose environmental law expertise had built the firm's reputation. I just got off the phone with opposing counsel, he announced. Hartwell Industries is offering a settlement. The room fell silent. Settlement discussions had been anticipated, but everyone had expected them to come much later in the process. What kind of offer? Tom asked. $2.4 million to be split among the 4 affected families, plus cleanup costs and ongoing monitoring, Peterson replied, in exchange for complete non-disclosure agreements and dismissal of all claims. Michael quickly calculated numbers in his head. That's $600,000 per family. It would cover our immediate losses and allow us to relocate the operation to clean land, with enough left over to upgrade equipment and maybe expand the herd, Sarah added. Evelyn studied the faces around the table, understanding that this moment represented a crossroads that would determine not just the Brennan family's future, but the broader fight against corporate agriculture's predatory practices. What about the non-disclosure agreement? She asked. Standard corporate settlement language, Rebecca explained. No public statements about the case, no cooperation with media or other potential plaintiffs, no discussion of Hartwell's practices or the contamination. Tom was quiet for several minutes, his weathered hands folded on the table. So they pay us to disappear quietly, and then they move on to the next group of family farms. That's how these cases usually work, Peterson acknowledged. The corporation makes the immediate problem go away while preserving their ability to continue the practices that created the problem. Sarah closed her research files. What happens to other farming families who are facing the same situation? They wouldn't know what we've learned about Hartwell's systematic targeting. That's not your responsibility, Rebecca said gently. Your job is to get the best outcome for your family. Michael stood and walked to the window overlooking downtown Madison. $600,000 would solve our immediate problems and give us a fresh start. We could buy clean land, rebuild the herd, start over without the stress of legal uncertainty. But it wouldn't stop Hartwell from doing the same thing to other farms, Tom said quietly. Evelyn realized that this decision would define not just how her career ended, but what her decades of service to farming families ultimately meant. What happens if we reject the settlement and proceed to trial? We could win significantly more money, establish legal precedents that protect other farms, and potentially trigger criminal investigations, Peterson replied. But we could also lose everything if a jury doesn't accept our evidence, or if Hartwell's legal team successfully discredits our case. What are the risks? Michael asked. Hartwell has unlimited resources for legal defense. They can drag this case out for years, appeal any adverse verdict, and make the process as expensive and difficult as possible, Rebecca explained. Even if you ultimately win, it could take 5 years or more to see any money. Sarah had been quietly reviewing her research materials. In the cases I studied, what happened to families who accepted early settlement offers? Most of them moved away and started over somewhere else, Rebecca replied. Some were successful, others struggled to rebuild, but none of them were in a position to help other families facing similar situations. Tom looked around the table, at his son, granddaughter, and the veterinarian who had become like family during their months of struggle. This isn't just about money anymore, is it? It never was just about money, Grandpa, Sarah said softly. Michael returned to the table, his expression reflecting the weight of a decision that would affect generations of his family. Dr. Hart, what do you think we should do? The question carried enormous responsibility. Evelyn's advice could determine whether the family chose financial security or continued fighting for broader principles that might cost them everything they had worked to build. I can't make this decision for you, she said carefully, but I can tell you what I've learned in 37 years of veterinary practice. The easy solution isn't always the right solution, and sometimes the most important victories require risking the most valuable things. Tom studied his calloused hands that had worked Meadowbrook Farm for nearly 5 decades. My great-grandfather Henrik came to this country with nothing but determination and the belief that hard work and honest dealing would be enough to build a good life. He looked up at his family. If we take the settlement, we're admitting that honest farming families can't compete against corporate operations that use fraud and environmental destruction as business tactics. Sarah reached across the table and took her grandfather's hand. If we fight and lose, we could lose everything. And if we fight and win? Michael asked. Rebecca Martinez smiled. If we fight and win, we establish precedents that protect family agriculture for generations to come. The room fell quiet as the 4 people who had worked together to uncover Hartwell Industries' systematic campaign against family farms contemplated the most important decision any of them had ever faced. Tom was the first to speak. Dr. Hart, you've already given up your retirement to help us. Are you prepared for what fighting this case to the end might cost all of us? Evelyn looked around the table at 3 generations of a farming family who had trusted her with their future, and at the legal team that was prepared to take on one of the most powerful corporate agricultural operations in the region. I've spent my entire career helping families protect the animals and land they love, she said. I can't think of a better way to finish that career than by helping protect the right of families to farm without being systematically destroyed by corporate criminals. The decision was made not with dramatic speeches or emotional appeals, but with the quiet determination of people who understood that some principles were worth more than financial security. The federal courthouse in Milwaukee buzzed with an energy that Evelyn had never experienced in her decades of veterinary practice. Media representatives filled the back rows of the courtroom, their cameras focused on what had become the most significant agricultural environmental case in Wisconsin history. The evidence box sitting on the plaintiff's table contained water samples, soil analysis reports, and photographic documentation that would either vindicate 4 farming families or destroy their credibility forever. Judge Patricia Morrison called the court to order, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had presided over complex environmental cases for over 20 years. We are here today in the matter of Brennan et al. Versus Hartwell Industries. Ms. Martinez, you may proceed with your opening statement. Rebecca Martinez stood and walked toward the jury, her voice calm but carrying the weight of months of preparation. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the next several days, you will hear evidence of one of the most systematic and deliberate campaigns of environmental fraud ever documented in American agriculture. Evelyn sat in the witness section, studying the 12 jurors who would determine the fate of everything the Brennan family had worked to build. Half appeared to be from rural backgrounds, their weathered hands and practical clothing suggesting familiarity with farming life. The others looked more urban, professional, the kind of people who might understand corporate malfeasance but have little experience with agricultural issues. The evidence will show that Hartwell Industries didn't accidentally contaminate neighboring properties, Rebecca continued. They systematically poisoned family farms as part of a calculated strategy to drive their owners into financial distress and force them to sell their land at below-market prices. Tom sat in the front row behind the plaintiff's table, wearing his best suit but looking uncomfortable in the formal courthouse setting. Beside him, Michael reviewed notes, while Sarah quietly observed the proceedings with the analytical attention of someone who understood that everything they had worked for depended on the next few days. Dr. Evelyn Hart, a respected veterinarian, with 37 years of experience in large animal medicine, will testify about the deliberate nature of the contamination that affected livestock on 4 family farms, Rebecca said, gesturing toward Evelyn. Her analysis will show that the pattern of animal health problems could only have resulted from intentional chemical applications designed to maximize environmental damage. The defense attorney, a polished corporate lawyer named David Richardson, made notes but showed no obvious reaction to the opening statement. His team had spent the morning reviewing thick files that undoubtedly contained strategies for discrediting every piece of evidence the plaintiffs planned to present. The physical evidence is undeniable, Rebecca continued, moving toward the evidence box. Water samples showing chemical concentrations that exceed safe levels by factors of 10 or more. Soil analysis demonstrating contamination patterns that follow property lines with mathematical precision. Agricultural chemical purchase records showing Hartwell Industries bought industrial-grade toxins in quantities far exceeding any legitimate farming application. Evelyn felt her heart rate increase as Rebecca approached the moment when expert testimony would begin. 3 months of preparation had led to this point, where her decades of veterinary expertise would be tested in a forum very different from examining sick animals in barn settings. Perhaps most damaging to the defendants, Rebecca said, you will see evidence that Hartwell Industries used identical tactics in 3 other states, systematically targeting family farms for environmental destruction and forced acquisition. This wasn't an accident or negligence, this was a business model. Judge Morrison nodded toward the defense table. Mr. Richardson, your opening statement. The corporate attorney stood with the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to defending large entities against individual plaintiffs. Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, my client Hartwell Industries is a legitimate agricultural operation that has contributed millions of dollars to the Wisconsin economy and provided hundreds of jobs in rural communities. Richardson walked toward the jury with practiced ease. The plaintiffs would have you believe that a successful agricultural business deliberately destroyed neighboring properties for the purpose of acquiring additional land. This theory requires you to ignore the economic reality that healthy neighboring farms are actually beneficial to agricultural communities. Evelyn noticed several jurors nodding slightly, and she realized that the defense strategy would focus on making Hartwell's alleged actions seem economically irrational rather than addressing the evidence directly. Dr. Hart is a respected veterinarian, but she is not an environmental scientist, not a toxicologist, and not an expert in agricultural chemical applications, Richardson continued. Her conclusions about deliberate contamination are based on speculation and emotional involvement with the plaintiff families, not scientific expertise. The attack was exactly what their legal team had predicted, but hearing her qualifications questioned in front of a jury still stung. Evelyn reminded herself that her decades of experience diagnosing environmental health problems in livestock provided exactly the expertise needed to understand this case. The evidence will show that any chemical applications by Hartwell Industries followed EPA guidelines and industry best practices, Richardson said. If neighboring properties experienced problems, those problems resulted from natural environmental factors, not deliberate contamination by my client. Judge Morrison looked toward the plaintiff's table. Ms. Martinez, call your first witness. Rebecca Martinez stood. The plaintiffs called Dr. Evelyn Hart. As Evelyn walked toward the witness stand, she carried with her not just the evidence that would determine the outcome of this case, but the hopes of 4 farming families and the broader principle that family agriculture deserved protection from corporate predators. The next hour would test everything she had learned in 37 years of veterinary practice. Evelyn's testimony unfolded over 6 hours, during which she methodically presented evidence that transformed technical environmental data into a compelling narrative of deliberate contamination. Her voice remained steady as she explained how the pattern of animal symptoms could only result from systematic chemical exposure designed to maximize harm rather than support legitimate agricultural purposes. "Dr. Hart," Rebecca Martinez asked, "in your professional opinion, could the contamination patterns you documented have occurred accidentally?" "No," Evelyn replied firmly. "The chemical applications were timed to coincide with weather patterns that would maximize runoff onto neighboring properties. The concentrations were far higher than necessary for crop production, and the specific substances used were chosen for their persistence in soil and water rather than their agricultural effectiveness." The jury listened intently as Evelyn explained how her examination of affected livestock had revealed systematic poisoning that progressed over months in a pattern that correlated perfectly with Hartwell Industries' documented chemical application. "Schedules. The animals didn't develop random health problems," she continued. "They developed specific symptoms in a specific sequence that matched known toxicological profiles for the chemicals found in water and soil samples from their grazing areas." Defense attorney Richardson began his cross-examination with the aggressive tone their legal team had expected. "Dr. Hart, you're not a toxicologist, are you?" "No, but I am a veterinarian with 37 years of experience diagnosing environmental health problems in livestock," Evelyn responded calmly. "And you're not an environmental scientist?" "My expertise is in understanding how environmental factors affect animal health, which is exactly what this case requires." Richardson moved toward the evidence table. "Dr. Hart, isn't it true that you decided to delay your retirement specifically to pursue this case?" The question was designed to suggest financial motivation, but Evelyn had prepared for this attack. "I delayed my retirement because I discovered evidence of systematic animal cruelty and environmental destruction that required immediate professional attention. But you stand to benefit financially from testifying in this case, don't you?" "I'm being compensated for my time as an expert witness, which is standard practice in legal proceedings. My conclusions are based on scientific evidence, not financial considerations." Judge Morrison called a brief recess, during which Rebecca Martinez quietly congratulated Evelyn on her performance under cross-examination. "You're doing exactly what we need. Staying calm, sticking to the facts, and demonstrating your expertise, rather than defending it." When court reconvened, Richardson attempted a different approach. "Dr. Hart, agricultural chemicals are used throughout Wisconsin agriculture. How can you be certain that contamination came specifically from Hartwell Industries rather than other sources?" This question played directly to Evelyn's strengths. "The chemical signature analysis shows specific substances that Hartwell Industries purchased in documented quantities. Additionally, the contamination pattern follows property lines and water flow patterns that point directly to Hartwell's application sites. But couldn't natural variations in soil and water chemistry explain some of these findings?" "Natural variations don't create contamination gradients that stop precisely at property boundaries," Evelyn replied. "And they don't correlate with documented chemical purchase and application records." Sarah watched from the gallery as her grandfather's detailed observational records were presented as evidence, demonstrating how his decades of careful farming had documented the systematic destruction of his land. Tom's weathered face showed quiet pride as the judge examined his handwritten journals, recognizing them as credible scientific documentation. The breakthrough moment came when Rebecca Martinez presented the settlement agreement, the key artifact that would prove Hartwell Industries' consciousness of guilt. The document, signed by Hartwell's legal team just days before trial, offered substantial compensation in exchange for complete non-disclosure about the company's practices. Dr. Hart, Rebecca asked, in your professional experience, why would a company offer millions of dollars in settlement if they believed their practices were legitimate and lawful? Richardson immediately objected, but Judge Morrison allowed the question. Companies typically offer settlements to avoid the expense and uncertainty of litigation, not necessarily because they admit wrongdoing. But in this case, Evelyn replied, the settlement offer came with unusually restrictive non-disclosure agreements that would prevent the affected families from warning other farmers about similar contamination risks. That suggests awareness that their practices posed ongoing threats to other properties. The jury's reaction was visible. Several members exchanged glances that suggested they understood the implication of a settlement designed to prevent victims from warning others. Richardson's final line of attack focused on emotional bias. Dr. Hart, isn't it true that you've become emotionally involved with the Brennan family during this process? I've developed respect for a farming family that has worked for 4 generations to be good stewards of their land, Evelyn replied. That respect doesn't compromise my scientific analysis. It motivates me to ensure that analysis is thorough and accurate. But emotional involvement can cloud professional judgment, can't it? Yes, it can. That's why I've been especially careful to base my conclusions on documented evidence rather than assumptions or feelings. When Evelyn stepped down from the witness stand after 7 hours of testimony, she felt the exhaustion that comes from sustained mental concentration under pressure. But she also felt something else. The satisfaction of having presented 37 years of professional expertise in service of principles that mattered more than personal comfort. Tom's quiet nod of approval and Sarah's proud smile told her that she had done what needed to be done. Now the jury would decide whether the evidence they had fought so hard to present would be enough to protect family agriculture from corporate predators. 6 months after the jury delivered their verdict, $4.2 million in compensatory damages and $8.7 million in punitive damages split among the 4 affected families, Evelyn drove through the familiar Wisconsin countryside toward Meadowbrook Farm. The spring morning carried the promise of renewal, and the rolling hills looked exactly as they had when this entire journey began, with a simple call about a dark patch on a cow's face. The gravel driveway crunched beneath her tires as she approached the farmhouse, but everything else about the scene had changed. New fencing marked clean pastures where healthy cattle grazed peacefully. Solar panels on the barn roof reflected the morning sun, part of the sustainable energy system that Sarah had designed using her agricultural engineering studies. Most significantly, a freshly painted sign by the road read, Meadowbrook Farm. But in 1923, renewed 2025, symbolizing both continuity and transformation. Tom emerged from the barn with the energetic stride of someone who had found new purpose in an old passion. At 76, he looked younger and more vital than he had during the months of crisis, his face carrying the satisfaction of a man who had fought for his principles and won. "Dr. Hart," he called out, his voice carrying warmth and genuine pleasure. "Perfect timing. I was just checking on Bessie and her new calf." They walked together toward the pasture, where the cow, whose mysterious markings had started everything, now grazed contentedly with a healthy Holstein calf at her side. The dark patch that had once marked Bessie's face had faded to barely visible traces, her coat restored to full health by months of clean environment and careful veterinary care. "She's completely recovered," Tom said, watching the mother and calf with obvious satisfaction. "All of them are. Clean water, uncontaminated soil, proper veterinary care. It's amazing how resilient animals can be when they're given a fighting chance." Sarah appeared from the direction of the house, carrying a tablet and wearing work clothes that spoke of serious involvement in daily farm operations. "Dr. Hart, I'm so glad you're here. I wanted to show you the results from our latest soil tests. The young woman had completed her degree and returned to Meadowbrook Farm full-time, bringing with her an impressive combination of traditional farming wisdom and cutting-edge agricultural science. Her research project on sustainable farming practices had evolved into a comprehensive plan for regenerative agriculture that was attracting attention from farming communities across the region. The soil remediation is complete, Sarah explained, showing Evelyn detailed charts on her tablet. Not only have we eliminated all traces of contamination, but the soil health is actually better than it was before the crisis. The organic matter content has increased, the pH balance is optimal, and beneficial microorganism populations are thriving. Michael joined them from the equipment barn, his clothes showing evidence of hands-on work rather than office meetings. The legal victory and financial settlement had allowed him to step away from his off-farm employment and dedicate himself fully to the family operation. The ironic thing, Michael said, is that fighting Hartwell Industries taught us more about farming than we might have learned otherwise. The research we did, the expert consultations, the detailed analysis of every aspect of our operation, it forced us to become better farmers. They walked together toward the eastern boundary, where the pastures that had once been contaminated now supported some of the healthiest cattle in the region. The legal victory had required Hartwell Industries not only to pay damages, but also to modify their operations to prevent future contamination of neighboring properties. "What happened to Hartwell Industries?" Evelyn asked. Tom's expression grew serious. "They're still operating, but under federal oversight now. The criminal investigation that followed our civil case resulted in several executives facing fraud and environmental destruction charges. Their systematic campaign against family farms has been exposed and stopped." Sarah looked toward the distant Hartwell facility, which now operated under strict environmental monitoring. More importantly, our case established legal precedents that are helping other farming families fight similar situations. We've been contacted by attorneys representing farmers in Iowa, Nebraska, and Montana who are using our evidence and legal strategies. The impact of their fight had extended far beyond Meadowbrook Farm. The legal victory had generated national media attention, congressional hearings on corporate agriculture practices, and new federal regulations designed to protect family farms from predatory environmental tactics. "Dr. Hart," Michael said, "there's something we wanted to show you." He led them to a small building near the farmhouse that hadn't existed during the crisis months. Inside, they found a consulting office equipped with modern technology and veterinary equipment. "We know you officially retired," Sarah said, "but we were hoping you might be interested in a different kind of practice. Consulting work, helping other farming families deal with environmental health issues, maybe training the next generation of veterinarians who understand the connection between animal health and sustainable agriculture." Evelyn looked around the well-equipped office, then out the window toward pastures where healthy cattle grazed in clean environment. The comfortable retirement she had once planned seemed distant and somehow less appealing than the purposeful work being offered. "The University of Wisconsin has expressed interest in having you develop a curriculum for veterinary students focusing on environmental health in agricultural settings," Tom added, "teaching the next generation of veterinarians what you've learned in 37 years of practice." As afternoon shadows lengthened across Meadowbrook Farm, Evelyn realized that her journey from routine veterinary call to environmental justice advocate had led her not to the end of her career, but to its most meaningful chapter. The dark patch on a cow's face had revealed not just contamination, but the possibility of using a lifetime of expertise in service of principles larger than individual cases. "When do I start?" she asked. The new sign by the road, Meadowbrook Farm, Esther 1923, renewed 2025, caught the setting sun as four people who had fought together to save a way of life looked toward a future that honored both tradition and progress, stewardship and innovation. family heritage and community responsibility. Sometimes the smallest discoveries lead to the most important transformations.